In September 1874, in the coal-scarred mountains of West Virginia, 3 armed men disappeared near Elkhorn Creek. Days later, their bodies were found in shallow graves on the muddy banks, each killed by gunfire from a weapon their murderer should never have been able to handle. The sole witness was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver, who emerged from the mountains carrying a rifle almost his own height, his clothes torn and stained with blood, speaking with a calm far beyond his years. Authorities buried the case as quickly as they buried the dead. But miners still whisper about the boy's cold eyes and the 3 words he uttered when asked about the killings. They deserved worse. Official records remain locked away in the Mercer County Courthouse, marked only with matter resolved by mutual agreement. Further investigation suspended by order of Sheriff W. Thornton. What the public never learned was that the dead men were enforcers for the Consolidated Coal Company, and Thomas Weaver had just declared war on the most powerful corporation in the state. Yet the real horror wasn't that September night, it was the months that followed when a boy's hunger for revenge reshaped the region's understanding of fear. By the fall of 1874, the mountains were dominated by an industry that consumed both coal and men. Once quiet valleys now thundered with mining machinery and coal trains, the air thick with dust and sulfur, replacing the crisp scent of pine with a metallic taste that coated every breath. The Consolidated Coal Company owned vast tracts of land and enforced its will through its private coal policemen without uniforms or badges who acted as judge, jury, and executioner in the remote hollows, drawn from the hardest remnants of post-Civil War society. Ex-Confederates Union veterans hardened by battle drifters and criminals. These men lived at a place called Devil's Rest, where they drank cheap whiskey and plotted new ways to intimidate the locals. Families like the Weavers, who had worked the land for generations, faced a grim choice between steady wages and company script spendable only at overpriced company stores and the slow death of independence. Housing was company-owned rent, deducted straight from wages, and debts ensured workers stayed trapped. Thomas lived with his father Samuel and older brother Jacob in one of the last independent homesteads near Elkhorn Creek, a log cabin built by his grandfather after the War of 1812. Inside, deer hides lined the walls. Trophies from a time before mining drove wildlife deep into the hills. Samuel Weaver was a man worn down by years in the mines. Hands gnarled, lungs scarred back, bent from low tunnels. A Union veteran, he had returned from war dreaming of quiet farming, only to see the coal company crush that hope. Mornings began before dawn in the freezing air, with Samuel waking his sons quietly so as not to disturb neighbors on other shifts. Breakfast was cornmeal with molasses, sometimes eggs from their last few chickens. The rest had died from breathing coal dust. Jacob, at 17, was tall, broad-shouldered, and quick-tempered, with a defiant spark in his eyes that made his father worry. Jacob had been working as a timber setter for 6 months, installing the wooden supports that kept mine tunnels from collapsing, a job that demanded strength, precision, and nerves of steel. One mistake could bury an entire crew alive. He had already watched 3 men die in accidents that could have been prevented if the company had invested in proper safety equipment. When he confronted his supervisor, Garrett Mills, a thin, rat-faced man with a smirk that never reached his eyes, about the rotting beams, Jacob was warned that questioning company policy was grounds for firing. Mills ended the conversation by hinting that accidents could happen to troublemakers. Thomas, unlike his father and brother, unsettled people without trying. Small for his age, but frighteningly perceptive, he could read intentions and motives with unnerving accuracy. While other children played, Thomas observed, watching the ways people moved, the words they avoided, and the patterns in their choices. His mother had died giving birth to him in the brutal winter of 1862, while Samuel was away fighting in the war. raised mostly by his grandfather Ezekiel Thomas, absorbed the old man's hard-edged philosophy in a world that punished weakness. Survival meant being more dangerous than the threats around you. Ezekiel, a veteran of the War of 1812 and a survivor of the unforgiving frontier, trained Thomas to hunt, track, shoot, and live off the land. His prized possession was a .44 caliber Spencer, repeating rifle 7 shots in the magazine fast as the lever could be worked, taken from a dying Union soldier during the retreat from Richmond, and kept in perfect condition ever since. Thomas could handle it like an extension of his own hands. But Ezekiel's lessons went beyond marksmanship. He taught the boy to move unseen, to read the ground for signs of life, to find food and water in hostile terrain, and to think like a predator. By September 1874, the region was ready to explode. The company had cut wages twice that summer, even as the store raised prices on staples like flour, bacon, and kerosene, driving families deeper into debt. Children went to bed hungry, while executives built mansions from the miners' labor. Cave-ins happened nearly every week. Any man refusing unsafe work was blacklisted, his family run out of town. The coal police, once limited to company property, now prowled independent settlements like the Weavers. They searched homes without warrants, stole livestock, and made quiet, wordless threats to anyone who dared speak out. The spark came on September 15th, when Samuel Weaver descended into mine number 7 for what would be his final shift, carrying a petition that had taken months to prepare. Written in his own careful hand on paper, the family could barely afford it, cataloged rotting supports ready to give way, deadly gas buildup from failed ventilation, and faulty equipment that made injuries inevitable. It also named the supervisors who threatened to fire and blacklist any miner who refused dangerous work. 47 men had signed. Ordinary miners pushed past their breaking point, knowing their names on the page might cost them their jobs or their lives. Samuel planned to present it to mine foreman Augustus Blackwood during shift change, when witnesses would be present and violence less likely. He believed reason might still work. But among those 47 signatures was one belonging to Henry Caldwell, a miner so deep in debt to the company store that betrayal had become his only way out. Henry Caldwell's youngest daughter was dying of consumption, and the company had made it clear her continued access to their doctor depended on his cooperation. Faced with choosing between loyalty to his fellow miners or his child's life, Caldwell made the only choice he could. By the time Samuel Weaver climbed down the ladder into mine number 7 that morning, Foreman Augustus Blackwood already knew about the petition and had alerted the coal police that action was needed. Blackwood, a man who'd secured his position through a mix of political connections and a willingness to crush dissent, didn't see the petition as a plea for safety, but as an act of rebellion threatening the control that kept profits flowing. The confrontation was quick. Samuel presented the petition calmly, explaining the men wanted nothing more than to work under conditions that didn't guarantee their deaths. Blackwood's pale eyes stayed fixed on Samuel's face as he tore the document to pieces and let them fall to the mine floor. "I want every man who signed this paper in my office after the shift," he said evenly. "We need to discuss their continued employment." Everyone knew those discussions often ended in fatal accidents, and Samuel understood he'd be signing his own death warrant by showing up. But not showing up would mean worse for his family. That evening, over cornbread beans and a rabbit Thomas had shot that morning, Samuel told his sons what had happened. He spoke of duty, honor, and the thin line between courage and foolishness. Jacob's reaction was pure fire: gather allies, arm themselves, and fight. Thomas said nothing, his dark eyes flicking between father and brother, reading not just their words, but the undercurrent of fear and resolve beneath them. Then came the sound of horses approaching at an unhurried pace. Riders who knew their prey had nowhere to go. Samuel rose, checking the hunting knife on his belt, and peered through the cabin's clouded window. Three men dismounted: Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchinson, and James Crawford, the coal company's enforcers. Finch, a former Confederate cavalry officer with icy eyes and a spotless black suit, led them. He carried twin Colt revolvers, worn smooth from use, and radiated the kind of cold intelligence that made his threats feel inevitable. Hutchinson was his opposite, massive, scarred, all muscle and brutality. A drifter after the war, he thrived on the pain and fear he inflicted. Crawford was the most dangerous because he seemed ordinary, with thinning hair and a shopkeeper's build. But he killed without emotion, treating violence as a practical tool. Finch spoke first, telling Samuel his employment was terminated, and the family had 30 days to vacate their cabin land, the company now claimed as theirs. It was a lie, but backed by guns and a corrupt legal system, it would stand as truth. Jacob asked almost politely what compensation they'd receive for the improvements they'd made over the years. The question earned him a savage backhand from Hutchinson that slammed him into the wall, blood spilling from his nose. When Samuel stepped forward, Crawford drew a nickel-plated Remington and pressed it to his temple. The steel in the man's calm, empty eyes said he'd pull the trigger without hesitation. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains," Weaver Crawford said softly. "Maybe it's time you and your boy learned some respect for your betters." What followed would etch itself into Thomas Weaver's mind forever, stripping away any illusions he still had about law, civilization, or mercy. As Samuel stood frozen with a revolver pressed to his head, and Jacob lay bleeding against the cabin wall, the three coal police spoke about the Weavers' fate with the cold detachment of men negotiating a business deal. Finch suggested making Samuel and Jacob vanish without a trace, leaving Thomas alive as a living warning to others. Hutchinson preferred a public hanging staged as vigilante justice, the bodies left swinging as a lesson. Crawford argued for the quietest solution: deep graves in the mountains where no one would ever find them. Thomas, sitting silent in the corner, watched as his father and brother were forced outside at gunpoint. Through the window, he saw them march toward the tree line, Finch carrying a coil of damp hemp rope, Crawford with a shovel, Hutchinson hefting a canvas sack that likely held lime to speed decomposition. Thomas knew with icy certainty they would not be coming back. But he was not the helpless child they believed. Trained for years by his grandfather, Thomas moved the moment their voices faded into the forest. From under a loose floorboard, he retrieved the Spencer repeating rifle and its pouch of 47 .44 caliber cartridges, each round perfectly maintained. The rifle felt natural in his hands. He had fired it thousands of times, loading and shooting 7 rounds in under 30 seconds, with an accuracy that had earned him the respect of seasoned hunters. Tonight his targets were the deadliest game in the mountains, men who killed for money and sport. The night favored Thomas. He knew how wind carried sound, how the terrain hid movement where every animal trail and rocky rise lay. Most importantly, he understood the first rule of violence: the enemy should never know they're in a fight until it's too late. The coal police believed they controlled the only 2 threats, and Thomas intended to use that blind confidence against them. Moving parallel to their path, he listened to their voices and anticipated their destination, Hangman's Hollow, a secluded clearing beside a tributary of Elkhorn Creek. Its grim history as a Civil War execution ground made it perfect for their work, private, intimidating, with water to wash away evidence. Reaching the clearing first, Thomas climbed onto a rocky ledge screened by mountain laurel, the Spencer resting in a natural groove of stone that steadied his aim. He lay still, listening, Hutchinson cursing the distance, Crawford musing about grave depth, Finch mocking Samuel's petition. When they finally stepped into the clearing, 4 figures in faint starlight, Thomas had them all in his sights. Samuel and Jacob were bound hand and foot, stumbling as their captors prodded them toward the clearing. The coal police had grown complacent, certain the remoteness of Hangman's Hollow made escape or rescue impossible. Finch ran the operation with the easy confidence of a man who'd overseen many such killings. He ordered Hutchinson to force the prisoners to their knees beside a fallen oak that would keep their bodies contained, while Crawford began digging a shallow grave with the practiced rhythm of long familiarity. The first shot came without warning. The crack of the Spencer shattered the night, a .44 caliber round striking Finch square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and pitching him into the creek where his blood darkened the water. Hutchinson and Crawford dove for cover, cursing into the darkness. But Thomas was already moving, sliding from his rocky perch to a new position before the echo faded. His hands worked the lever action without thought: eject, reload, aim, breathe, squeeze. Less than 3 seconds later, the second bullet slammed through Hutchinson's skull as he tried to drag Jacob into position as a shield. The giant fell forward, his dead weight pinning Jacob, but leaving him unhurt. Crawford, suddenly alone, abandoned the prisoners and bolted for the tree line in a blind rush for his horse, just as Thomas had anticipated. The boy tracked his target through the shifting branches, calculating speed and distance the way his grandfather had taught him to hunt deer. The shot struck Crawford square between the shoulders, 20 yards from the trees, dropping him face first into the creek bank, where he slid halfway into the water. The clearing fell silent, but for the stream's soft murmur and the ragged breathing of Samuel and Jacob, staring at the 3 dead men and trying to grasp that their 12-year-old had just saved them. Thomas stepped from the shadows, the Spencer held loosely in his hands, his expression calm and unshaken. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling to cut his father's bonds with a knife drawn from somewhere in his clothes. His voice was steady, almost casual, betraying none of the adrenaline or horror the moment should have carried. Samuel, rubbing life back into his wrists, could only stare, seeing not a boy, but a predator who had navigated the dark, chosen his ground, and killed 3 armed men with soldier's precision. Most disturbing of all, Thomas showed no hint of distress or moral hesitation about what he had done. "They were going to kill you," he said flatly, while cutting Jacob's bonds. "I couldn't let that happen." His reasoning was chilling in its simplicity. No anger, no fear, only a calculated solution to a lethal problem. He had killed 3 men with the same emotional detachment he might show when hunting rabbits for dinner. But Samuel and Jacob did not yet realize the deeper truth that Thomas had been preparing for this moment for months. The vantage point, the route through the forest, even the timing of his shots, had been rehearsed in solitude. He had always known the coal company would come, and the only surprise was how long it took. Samuel's plan in those desperate hours beside Elkhorn Creek was simple, yet devastating. But it was Thomas who shaped the finer details, with an unsettling grasp of human behavior and institutional corruption. The 3 dead coal police would be buried on the spot, their disappearance written off as the hazards of their work. Samuel and Jacob would die as well, at least on paper, through staged evidence suggesting they were killed in retaliation for the missing security men. Thomas would remain behind as the sole survivor of a tragedy that never happened. The cost of the deception was immense. Samuel and Jacob would abandon their home possessions and identities, vanishing hundreds of miles away under assumed names. They could never return to West Virginia or contact Thomas directly. The boy would face the world alone, armed only with his rifle, his mind in the understanding that survival sometimes demanded becoming more dangerous than the threats around you. It was a loneliness no child should endure, and it would shape every relationship he would ever attempt. The burials took most of the night. Samuel and Jacob dug by moonlight, working quickly, but with care. Thomas kept watch, listening for hoofbeats or voices, his ears tuned to the forest's smallest shifts in sound. He offered practical advice about soil depth, drainage, and camouflage details no 12-year-old should know. The graves went beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient oak, where new growth would hide the disturbance and make recovery nearly impossible. Leaf litter and forest debris concealed the fresh earth, and Thomas marked nearby trees with subtle blazes only he could read. At dawn, They gathered their few belongings. Samuel pulled Thomas aside for a farewell that was also a charge for the future. Remember that we love you. Remember that what we're doing is necessary, not just to save us, but to protect other families. And remember that someday, when you're strong enough, you can make sure this never happens again. Thomas nodded gravely, but his eyes held plans. His father could not imagine schemes that reached beyond survival toward a calculated campaign of retribution. The staged crime scene at the cabin was a masterpiece of misdirection. Furniture overturned to hint at a struggle. Jacob's blood scattered in convincing patterns. Samuel's possessions selectively moved to suggest trophies taken by the killers. Crucially, Thomas planted evidence implying his father and brother had been captured alive, likely for questioning or execution. 3 days later, hunters found him on a mountain trail, rifle in hand, clothes torn and blood-stained. He played his role perfectly, traumatized, yet coherent, helpful, without seeming suspicious, sympathetic without requiring care that might expose inconsistencies. He told Sheriff William Thornton the blood came from trying to help his wounded father before the company men dragged him away, and that his clothes were torn, fleeing through the dark. His calm demeanor was explained as shock, a detail no one thought to challenge when faced with a boy who appeared to have lost everything. Sheriff William Thornton had survived Reconstruction by mastering the art of asking only the questions he could afford to hear answered. At 53, he had seen enough blood, greed, and political rot to know that the truth was often more dangerous than the crime itself. When his search party uncovered the 3 coal police buried near Elkhorn Creek, he understood instantly that this was no simple case of corporate intimidation. It was a powder keg that could ignite the county's fragile balance of power. The bodies told a story far more troubling than the official version he would later write. The men had been shot with an accuracy that spoke of military training or rare marksmanship, and the angles suggested a shooter firing from elevation, something the surrounding terrain barely allowed. Yet the only surviving witness was a 12-year-old boy who should have been cowering in fear, not dispatching armed killers. Thornton's investigation became an exercise in deliberate blindness. Under pressure from the mining company and his own instincts for self-preservation, he crafted a report that met legal requirements while avoiding the darker implications. Officially, Marcus Finch Dale Hutchinson and James Crawford died in a violent confrontation with Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who then fled. Thomas, traumatized but alive, was the sole surviving witness to a dispute that had escalated. But those who knew what precision shooting looked like could see the holes in that story and in Thomas's demeanor. The boy's composure unsettled even hardened men. When questioned, he would meet their gaze with those dark, unblinking eyes and speak in brief, precise sentences that gave nothing away. The company men came for Papa and Jacob, he would say. There was shooting. I ran into the woods and hid until morning. Technically true, yet empty of detail. The coal company, faced with the loss of 3 enforcers and the risk of public scrutiny, chose to bury the incident literally and figuratively. They tightened security policies, but opted not to pursue vengeance. It was a decision they mistook for prudence. To Thomas, it was weakness, and weakness invited action. That winter, accidents began to erode the company's power. Brutal supervisors suffered fatal falls down mine shafts. Store managers who'd bled families dry were found dead in their homes, valuables untouched. The killings were precise, efficient, and left no trail. By February 1876, Thornton received a message that shattered his carefully maintained illusions. Dr. Marcus Henley, the company's own physician, reported that 3 more employees had died in the past month under circumstances that were accidental only at first glance. Garrett Mills, the same supervisor who had threatened Jacob, plunged into a shaft during an inspection. The witnesses swore he wasn't near the edge before pitching forward as if pushed. Vernon Polk, the store manager notorious for price gouging, was found dead at his desk from an apparent heart attack until the coroner discovered a thin puncture wound behind his left ear, clean and deliberate. And Augustus Blackwood, the foreman who had torn up Samuel's petition, was found sitting at his kitchen table, coffee cooling beside him, his face locked in a rictus of pure terror. No marks, no signs of entry or struggle, only the unmistakable certainty that something had stopped his heart through sheer unrelenting fear. These were not random deaths. They were messages. And Thornton was beginning to suspect that Thomas Weaver had been writing them since the night by Elkhorn Creek. Dr. Henley's message contained one final detail that told Sheriff Thornton this could no longer be ignored. Each of the dead men had been found with a scrap of paper tucked into their pocket, a single word scrawled in neat, childish handwriting: justice. That afternoon, Thornton rode alone into the high country, following reports of thin smoke rising from a remote valley miles from town. What he found there would follow him for the rest of his life. Nestled against the trees was a makeshift camp that could only be described as a private training ground. There were shooting ranges laid out at staggered distances, obstacle courses fashioned from logs and rock, and maps, dozens of them, detailing every coal company facility in the region. Wooden human figures stood in lifelike poses at varying heights and angles, carved with eerie accuracy and marked with notes on vital organs, arterial lines, and the angles needed for a killing shot. Some were rigged on ropes and pulleys, jerking unpredictably to mimic moving targets. The most disturbing find was a thick, handwritten journal. Inside were meticulous records of company men, daily movements, habits, fears, and weaknesses. There were floor plans of homes, timetables of when each target would be alone, and psychological profiles sharp enough to have come from a seasoned detective. This was not the work of a boy playing soldier. This was the preparation of an assassin. Thornton was still leafing through the pages when Thomas appeared, stepping from behind a wall of mountain laurel with his Spencer rifle in hand. At 13, he was still small, dark-haired, and sharp-eyed, but there was nothing boyish about the way he moved or spoke. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," he said evenly. Dr. Henley was bound to notice the patterns. He's sharper than the rest. What followed was less a confession than a briefing. Thomas outlined each killing as if delivering a tactical report, explaining how timing, terrain, and method had been chosen to match the victim's crimes. Garrett Mills had forced men into unsafe conditions that killed at least 6 miners, so he died the same way, plummeting into darkness. Vernon Polk had starved families with inflated prices and extorted desperate women, so his death was slow and deliberate. Augustus Blackwood had caused a cave-in that killed Thomas's cousin, so he died frozen in the same terror he'd wielded against others. When Thornton asked how a 13-year-old could possess such skill, Thomas's answer was as chilling as the crimes. His grandfather Ezekiel had not only taught him to hunt, but had passed down the lethal wisdom of 3 generations of mountain fighters, men who had survived wars, wilderness, and lawless frontiers by being more dangerous than anything they faced. Civilization. Ezekiel had taught him offered no protection against those willing to break its rules. And now Thomas was proving that lesson true. Ezekiel Weaver had not raised Thomas merely as a hunter. He had forged him into a weapon for the moments when ordinary justice failed. Grandfather always said, "Sheep produce wolves when they forget how to be sheepdogs." Thomas told Thornton, his dark eyes holding a depth of certainty no child should possess. The coal company forgot that mountain people have been killing their enemies longer than corporations have existed. When Thornton asked if he felt any remorse, Thomas paused as though weighing a question of deep moral philosophy. His answer would linger in the sheriff's mind for decades. "Sheriff, do you feel remorse when you put down a rabid dog?" These men were diseases. They destroyed families, killed children through greed and neglect, turned honest work into slavery. I didn't murder them. I performed surgery on a sick community. The only tragedy is how long it took for someone to do what needed to be done. The final clash between Thomas Weaver and the forces that had shaped his life was not fought with bullets, but with negotiation. Sitting with Thornton beside Elkhorn Creek, the site where 3 company enforcers had once been buried, Thomas spoke with the calm precision of a general dictating terms. He would not vanish into the hills quietly. His demands were explicit compensation for the families of miners killed in preventable accidents, immediate installation of safety equipment, and the dismantling of the coal police. Most unsettling of all, he wanted it in writing documents that would bind the company to its promises. "You think this ends with me leaving?" Thomas said, his 13-year-old voice carrying the weight of someone far older. "But I've already taught them something. They'll never forget fear. They used to sleep soundly behind guns and money. Now they know these mountains grow predators they can't imagine." The standoff lasted 3 days. Company executives, shaken by the losses already suffered and terrified of an enemy they could not find, agreed to terms they would have once dismissed outright. But Thomas pressed for more proof of compliance, regular safety reports, and a network of miners' children to act as his eyes and ears across the region. The change was swift and unmistakable. Within weeks, long-requested safety gear appeared in the mines. Prices at company stores dropped overnight. The worst supervisors were quietly reassigned far from West Virginia. And the coal police, once the unchallenged enforcers of corporate will, were simply gone, their boarding house at Devil's Rest, abandoned so suddenly that half-finished meals still sat on the tables. Sheriff Thornton eventually realized Thomas's reach went far beyond fear. For months, the boy had been quietly recording every safety violation, every act of corporate abuse, every family pushed toward starvation by company policies. Before leaving West Virginia, he compiled it all into meticulous reports that somehow found their way to newspapers in Charleston, Baltimore, and Washington. Accounts so damning the coal company couldn't buy their way out of the investigations they triggered. Years later, letters from Ohio painted a picture of Thomas's transformation. Outwardly, he had shed his past, building a reputation in Cincinnati as a respectable businessman. Yet the undercurrent in his words was unmistakable. He was still calculating, still preparing for the next battle. By 1885, Thomas had become exactly what his grandfather had shaped him to be, a weapon now disguised as a pillar of the community. He invested in mining equipment manufacturers, railroad lines, serving coal towns, and banks that financed the industry itself. With money instead of bullets, he pressured companies into protecting workers across 3 states. The miners of West Virginia never knew the truth, but they felt his unseen hand for decades. Union organizers found their coffers mysteriously replenished. Safety advocates discovered companies suddenly willing to negotiate. Children from mining families received scholarships that carried them far from the coal camps and the generational servitude that had trapped their parents. When Thomas died in 1924, hundreds attended his Cincinnati funeral, honoring the man they believed to be a generous philanthropist. But that same week, across Appalachia, something strange rippled through the industry. Planned safety cuts were abandoned overnight. Union negotiations suddenly turned cooperative. And in several camps, the most feared mine guards simply vanished. The flood of 1915 had already uncovered 3 skeletons near Elkhorn Creek, recorded as unknown casualties of labor violence. But investigators never found the 4th grave hidden deeper in the forest, the final resting place of Henry Caldwell, the informant who had betrayed Samuel Weaver's petition. Thomas had saved him for last, visiting on a frigid February night in 1876, just days before heading north. Thornton had carried the knowledge of that killing to his own grave. It was only when the sheriff's journals were found after his death in 1899 that the full truth emerged in a single chilling line. boy understood something the rest of us never learned, that evil creates its own nemesis. And sometimes that nemesis wears the face of a child who learned too early that mercy is a luxury the innocent cannot afford. Thomas Weaver's story is a reminder that the most terrifying transformations don't happen in moments of supernatural horror, but in the slow corruption of innocence by relentless cruelty. He was not born a killer, he was forged into one by men who never imagined their prey might learn to hunt them in return. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.